Gotta talk Notre Dame here at MarkRogersTV, the voice of college football. Best discussion, debate, and analysis. That's the mission. Every day we aim to deliver. Hit that bell for the notifications once you've subscribed. That way you know when we're going live, which we do each and every day. We got Nathan Erbach on the line. A Notre Dame podcast to be named. No, truly, a Notre Dame podcast to be named. Nathan, how you doing today?
I'm doing good, Mark. I'm doing good. We still, like I said, me and Nick Shepkowski out of 670 The Score in Chicago, still working on a name for the podcast. Obviously, it's fairly new. We've only had a couple episodes here and there, and he's more known in the Chicago area for some of his Chicago sports stuff, and then obviously I'm a little more known for my Irish breakdown days and stuff like that. So, but yeah, no, it's been fun, and we're getting back there with the podcast, and it's been a fun ride so far.
When you get that name, you let us know.
Will do.
Or you could just go my route. I can't think of good names for shows, so I just call them like Nebraska Cornhuskers Live, Ohio State Buckeyes Live. There you go. All right, good stuff. So before we get to what's going out on the field right now with Notre Dame, there's big recruiting news. Much of it speculative, just in regards to who's interested in the Irish right now. But a big flip coming in on the USC side. I believe originally a Notre Dame commit, flipping to USC, coming on back to the Irish, and Philip Riley, a top 20 cornerback, top 40 player in Florida.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, he committed to Notre Dame during all of the COVID stuff. I think back in March, April, around that time. Had never been to campus. So he was one of those kids that, took a leap of faith, committed to Notre Dame. About a month ago or so, he sort of, felt maybe he rushed the decision, hadn't been to a lot of campuses yet, wanted to explore some of those options. And obviously the dead period or the recruiting period got extended again. And I guess he took a trip out to Notre Dame here in the last couple weeks. Notre Dame was kind of in his ear in that regard, and just was, hey man, we really want you back, and we'd love for you to come see the campus. So him and his, I think him and his family came out kind of on their own dime. Notre Dame was actually on the road that weekend. I think it was Georgia Tech weekend, and he realized why he committed to Notre Dame to begin with. So I think he technically decommitted secretly from USC about a couple, maybe a week ago or so. And then flipped back to Notre Dame officially yesterday or last night. So, but it was something that most Notre Dame fans here knew for the last several days at least.
Nathan, you've got me scrambling to the 247 rankings here on all these players that Notre Dame's in on, and it's pretty impressive. So run them down, starting with Sierra Wright.
Yeah, cornerback out of the LA area. Most people probably peg him for USC, and I think I would probably peg him for USC as well. But there's a lot of talk out there that if he does end up leaving the West Coast, that Notre Dame's probably the team to beat there. He visited Michigan, I think, this last weekend, so they're certainly in the mix. But I wouldn't expect them to land him, just kind of from everything I know. I would still kind of, like I said, I would still probably peg USC here. He's big into the acting and different things like that. And we know USC has a terrific theater program and film program and stuff like that. So I think that certainly plays a role. But we all know with recruiting, when you win and when you're a school like Notre Dame and you're winning and you're beating teams like Clemson and stuff like that, it certainly helps with recruits. And Sierra Wright's one of those guys that they've always been in the mix with, but maybe even more so now with the season that they're having.
So, Nathan, we're also looking at Donovan Edwards, a 5-star out of Michigan, second-rated running back in the country, number 2 player out of Michigan, number 36th ranked player, regardless of position. So if you don't follow recruiting, that's way up the board on the 247 Sports Composite.
Yeah, another kid that Notre Dame they offered a long time ago. Very, very early on in the process with him, people, thought Notre Dame had a legitimate chance the last year or so. So it's been a while now. He had kind of just been trending in the wrong direction. But at the same time, he's a Michigan kid that is not committed yet. So it's just from that perspective alone, you're kind of wondering what's going on there. I mean, he's talked about wanting to be close to home. Notre Dame and Michigan kind of offer him the best chance there from, to kind of stay close. Everywhere else that he's kind of in on is mostly in the Southeast region. So, but he's definitely a kid that with the season that they're having, and specifically beating Clemson, they're gaining a lot of momentum there. I wouldn't necessarily predict that the Notre Dame wins that battle. But with them having a really good season, and then with obviously Michigan having the season that they're having, it's definitely put Notre Dame back in the mix, and they have a legitimate shot. And if they do land him, he was pretty much right up there with Will Shipley. I think we've talked about him several times back before he committed to Clemson. It was kind of a 1A, 1B situation there, and they ended up kind of putting the chips in the basket for Shipley because they thought they had a better chance with him. He ended up committing to Clemson, and then turned the attention to Edwards. Landed another kid right now that they have in Logan Diggs, who's a really quality running back recruit out of Louisiana. But they want to pair Donovan Edwards with him, and obviously if they land him, he'd probably be the best running back recruit they've landed in the last probably 8 to 10 cycles.
I was going to say he's not just watching Notre Dame's games; he's watching Michigan's games.
Right. And I hate to say it, I think most if there's any Michigan fans on here, I've been pretty vocal. I'm not a huge Michigan hater as a Notre Dame guy. I'm out here in Las Vegas, so a lot of my hatred as a fan, and even I guess to a certain extent as an analyst, goes towards more USC, and then in more recent years, somewhat Stanford as well. Michigan to me is a great rival of Notre Dame, and I wish they played them every year. I don't root against them. I actually have a lot of friends that are Michigan fans as well. So it's more jabbing back and forth in a friendly way, more so than I know a lot of Notre Dame fans that absolutely hate Michigan, and that's just not who I am personally.
We've got Nathan Urbach on the line. Catch him on Twitter. We talk Notre Dame football with Nathan on a pretty regular basis. We talked a lot, of course, prior to the Clemson game and after the Clemson win. Then that goes right into the Boston College game, which it was conventional thinking to a certain extent that BC's the type team that gives this type of a team a fit because they did to Clemson, of course, 2 weeks earlier. It's a trap game, a letdown. Notre Dame showed some maturity in that game, certainly showed that they were prepared for BC. They weren't going to let down. And maybe this is just kind of a different level Notre Dame team.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing that a lot of Notre Dame fans are seeing right now. They made a lot of mistakes in that game. They fumbled the ball a couple times, and it was one of those games where they pretty much dominated from a possession standpoint, from a yardage standpoint, and so on and so forth. But they kind of let Boston College to an extent hang around, or at least give them a little bit of hope. Because they kept turning the ball over. I think they had 3 fumbles, and all of them were recovered by Boston College, which is crazy to think about. But overall, that's a game that maybe 3 years ago they lose because they just didn't. Maybe they didn't have the talent. Maybe their offense wasn't able to physically dominate the entire game like they did. So it's good to see that they have a level of cushion that we know that some of those elite teams like Bama, Clemson, and Ohio State have.
So now Notre Dame's off. They're undefeated. They take on North Carolina next. And that was one of the games I pegged preseason as a key game once it was announced Notre Dame would be playing an ACC schedule and competing for the conference championship. Actually, my selection was Notre Dame and North Carolina to tie for the ACC championship game second slot at 9-2. So here they are coming up. Carolina doesn't need to take a backseat to anyone offensively. They probably have a top 5 offense in the country with Sam Howell, all the playmakers on the outside. Javonte Williams is little regarded nationally, but he's averaging like 8 yards per carry. They are so explosive, but giving up ridiculous amounts of points to teams like Wake Forest and Virginia.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's where the game's won. If I had to pick right now, it is a road game. Notre Dame's a little bit banged up right now. Fortunately, they have the bye week, so they can kind of get some of their guys healthy. But I don't see it, kind of like how Boston College was. I thought Boston College would be able to score a little bit. Just Jurkovec's a talented weapon, and they have a couple other. They have some good receivers. Their tight end's good, and that's kind of the same way I view North Carolina, but just maybe on steroids, I guess. Sam Howell, I think, is a better quarterback than Jurkovec at this point. One of my favorite quarterbacks in the country, actually. And then, like you said, their running backs, averaging 8 yards a carry, which is really impressive. But I'm not sure that they'll be able to keep up the pace with Notre Dame overall. And that's one thing I actually mentioned right after the Boston College games. It really looks like Notre Dame is going to be able to move the ball against anyone. And because their defense is talented and good and for the most part pretty healthy as well, I just don't see how most teams in the country are going to be able to match them, touchdown for touchdown, essentially.
You mentioned Jurkovec and his performance against Notre Dame. A lot was made, of course, for obvious reasons, and should be made. Him transferring from Notre Dame to BC and then getting a shot at the Irish, it not turning out too well for him. But in watching the game, did you gather anything was different about the way he approached the game, the way Notre Dame players approached him? There were a number of anecdotes that were passed along during the game about his relationship with Ian Book, his relationship, and still having a number of friends on the Notre Dame team.
I will say, just as a fan standpoint, it was kind of annoying during the game to have to listen to that, because I thought that it was a little overblown. Kids transfer all the time these days, and I get that it's a cool storyline, but man, I mean, let's watch some football without having to mention a kid's name every 5 seconds. And a couple other people mentioned it too, is, Notre Dame has a few guys that were sort of in the same situation as him, maybe playing different positions, but they stuck it out. And now they're playing key roles on the roster, and they were barely mentioned. And I think that that's almost something that you should mention even more so, because I think those are cool stories as well, I guess. Other than that, though, I mean, like I said, he's a talented player. He's not. I don't think he's fully there yet. I mean, I think he leads the ACC in passing yardage. I mean, obviously there's the talent level there. He's a good runner. Really physical in terms of, I think he's like 6'5", 240. So a lot of people kind of are comparing him to Big Ben. He's from the Pittsburgh area, so I mean that comparison obviously is there because of that reason, I think, to an extent. But he struggled. I mean, Notre Dame, I think Clark Lee specifically, as his one of his former coaches, was able to kind of lock in on what he does well, and he kept him for the most part inside the pocket and didn't really let him get out of the pocket and make plays. And I think he finished 18 for 40. So even though he had some yardage and he didn't really turn the ball over a whole lot, maybe some of those were a little lucky. I think they called the phantom face mask call, which maybe would have been a pick six, and ended up being a Boston College touchdown after that a few plays later. But yeah, no, I think the kid's going to has a good career ahead of him. And at least for that specific day, I think Notre Dame had his number overall.
MarkRogersTV, the voice of college football. Lock it in right here. Please give us a like. And also share the videos on social media. A lot of people out there obviously don't know we're around talking college football every day. Once you subscribe, hit that bell for the notifications, and you can catch up with our live streams, which go on all week. Ian Book played a really clean game against BC, and I watched most of this game until it failed to be competitive. 20 of 27 for 285, 3 touchdowns, no picks. I don't always buy into these kind of narratives and storylines, but do you think there's a possibility that maybe he's just an extra level of confidence in his abilities since he pulled it off against Clemson?
I think, yeah. I mean, I think that's a pretty good observation. Probably maybe the two best games he's played in his Notre Dame career, at least back to back, and against like quality competition. Obviously, I mean, that's something to be said. I mean, when he's playing New Mexico or playing South Florida or something like that, he's going to put up some big numbers, of course. But at least in terms of, Power Five, one of them being the number one team in the country, another one being a rival of sorts. You're playing your former backup QB. That's obviously, once your number, and that can bring out some emotion, of course, as well. So, no, I mean, I think maybe yesterday or Saturday was Book's best game of his career. And then Clemson probably was right up there in terms of top 5 in terms of numbers. I mean, that's going to go down as a legacy game for him overall. But no, he's playing a level of football right now that I don't think we've seen him play.
Notre Dame, North Carolina, the day after Thanksgiving, 3:30 Eastern time on ABC. That should be a fun one. And Notre Dame even getting some respect at this point, Nathan, where it's almost conventional thought that even if they lose the ACC championship game, they could make the playoff.
Yeah, I think the only thing that could change that, obviously, outside of a loss or something like that prior to that and still making the ACC championship game, if they lose, and whether or not people want to agree with this or not, if they lose pretty big while Lawrence is the quarterback, then I could see maybe, an Oregon that's undefeated, or whoever making it in over Notre Dame. But if it's a close game, if they're able to score and look productive again like they did, in the game a couple weekends ago, I think it's going to be hard to keep both teams out. Now, obviously, if Clemson loses the second time, then maybe there's a more legitimate argument to have them out, instead of maybe over an Oregon or something like that. But if they both go 1-1 against each other and both games are really good, really close games, then I think that you probably got to put them back in there.
Now, of course, your evaluation could change if they don't look the part against North Carolina, or certainly in an ACC championship game rematch. But as it stands right now, assuming we get the chalk formula, Ohio State, Alabama, Clemson, and then Notre Dame's the 4th team, would you feel, based on what you've seen from the other teams and know about the other teams and Notre Dame to date, feel more confident, not necessarily that they just go out there and win these games, but that they're in that pack of 4 legitimately and could represent themselves well?
Absolutely. I mean, I think just the way that they handled themselves against Clemson, and we talked about this when post game after that performance. I mean, they moved the ball against that kind of defense, even regardless of the injuries. I mean, that's still a team that's producing 5-star talent on a regular basis. They moved the ball more so than I thought that they could have, even with a good offense. I mean, they were sort of one-dimensional to an extent going into that game. Book and his receivers weren't necessarily playing their best football, but the offensive line and the rushing attack was dominant. And one thing I was scared of was that they'd be able to stop the rushing attack more so than other teams were, and then Book and the receivers weren't going to be able to make plays down the field. And that was pretty much the exact opposite of what happened. And it continued on against Boston College. The receivers are growing with confidence. Book's playing his best football. And at this point, I'd be pretty surprised that if there was a defense in the country that would be able to contain them, at least to an extent where they wouldn't be able to put up some points.
Nathan Urbach talking Notre Dame football here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. Follow Nathan on Twitter, and hopefully we'll get that podcast going week to week, and we'll be able to publicize that, get it out there as well. Always appreciate you coming on board, Nathan.
Absolutely. Thanks, John.